Good evening. And if you're on the West Coast like I am, good afternoon. Welcome to tonight's webinar, The State of the System. My name is David Hunt. I'm the Education Director at Cardis. I wish I could see all of your faces and that you could see each other, because tonight we have a tremendous audience of leaders, policymakers, and influencers within the education system across the country. But before we get started, just two quick things. On your screen, you'll see there's a Q&A button and there's a chat button. So as questions come up, please put your questions in the Q&A throughout the evening. We'll have time at the end for questions. And in the chat, you should see a link to Paul's book, The State of the System. Order it through McGill, Queen's University Press. Don't go through Amazon like I did. It doesn't arrive until at the earliest Friday, October 2nd. Otherwise, I'd have a hard copy to show you. So that link should be there in the chat. And now, it is my great pleasure to introduce a leading Canadian education researcher, former head of school, former professor, founding director of Schoolhouse Consulting, lead researcher at the Schoolhouse Institute, and of course the author of The State of the System from Halifax, Nova Scotia, Dr. Paul Bennett.
Well, it's very great to be with you tonight, David, and thank you so much for the invitation. I'm just delighted to be given this opportunity to not only respond to the COVID-19 crisis and its impact on the schools, but to draw on my own work and lessons from my new book, The State of the System, A Reality Check on Canada's Schools. So again, thank you to you for inviting me and to everyone for joining us tonight. I'm looking forward to the exchange. The school system shutdown really had a tremendous impact on the system. And the first phase of COVID-19 was much like what I've described as a power outage, which left students and parents in the dark and educators everywhere scrambling to master unfamiliar forms of educational technology. That much we know. We also know that making radical adjustments following lockstep with public health directives upset the normal order in Canadian K-12 education. Education tends to be siloed, and so following public health directives came as quite a shock to everyone in the system. Emergency home learning is what we call the process and what happened. And what emerged to fill the vacuum was what online learning expert Michael K. Barber, a Canadian, presently teaching in California, he aptly termed it triage schooling in the education emergency room. That's a great phrase and one that was repeated over and over again in the media. What it was all about was actually stabilizing a shaken school system that was trying to turn the lights back on and provide students and teachers with the kind of education continuity that no one had forecast. We know what happened. 3 months of slapped together home learning produced predictable results. Bored and tuned out students, exhausted parents, and exasperated teachers. Perhaps a few of you fall into that category tonight. The centralized and overly bureaucratic school system described in my new book, The State of the System, A Reality Check on Canada's Schools, proved to be, let's face it, vulnerable and ill-equipped to respond to the massive COVID-19 pandemic disruption. Totally unexpected and, of course, unprecedented. There goes that word again. Instead of rising to the unexpected challenge, provincial school leaders took refuge, I'm afraid, in clinging to comfortable structures and ingrained policy responses. How else did they know how to respond? And they focused on things such as reworking labor contracts to ensure that, that the provision of service would extend beyond 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And they delayed the implementation of e-learning until all students had access to technology and the internet. That probably cost 3 more weeks of teaching and learning time. We know what happened after 3 months. When it was over, 3 months of school was essentially written off, although students were given grades, and we've never really had any accountability for how those grades were determined and how they compared with previous years. But more alarming, about 1/4 of all students, and that's a conservative estimate, went completely missing and were unaccounted for in the Canadian public education system. In some jurisdictions in the United States, it was as high as 1 out of every 3 students. So I chose an estimate based on a CBC investigation in a few provinces, and I put it at about 1/4 of all students missed out completely on education. So it turned out to be, and this is my expression from the Ottawa Citizen, doing your best education under impossible circumstances. And the question is that good enough? Or as a firm critic from Alberta, Dr. Nung Tran Davies described it in a masterful form of expression, a failure of epidemic proportions. And I think for many parents it was. Let's turn to my book and what you can learn from my book. It's, as you will quickly find out if you choose to buy it and flip through it, you'll see it's a pretty substantial book that looks at the broad sweep of history, but it's mostly about the triumph of the modern bureaucratic education state and how it came to dominate our lives in anyone in education, be they students, parents, teachers, administrators. Anyone with anything to do with education knows the face of the modern bureaucratic education state. The modern bureaucratic education state has a fundamental problem, and its roots run very deep. Since the rise and expansion of what I've termed the modern bureaucratic education system over the last 100 years, public education in Canada has grown far more distant and much less connected with those it serves, students, families, teachers, and communities. It's not unlike any other of our social institutions, but one would have expected that the institution that has the care and development and education of children might have seen it differently and made other decisions. This cartoon here is priceless. It shows the ministry and the masses. And the masses are aggregated outside the ministry offices, and they're being offered something they never asked for. And isn't that typical of interactions with school boards? When you're offered something, it's rarely what you've been clamoring for, and it's not really satisfying the needs. In this case, the clamoring was for more knowledge-based curriculum and higher standards and a better focus on reading and mathematics in the elementary grades. Does that sound familiar? That seems to be the battle cry everywhere. Our public schools, initially established with the best of intentions as the vanguard of universal, accessible, free education. What a wonderful ideal, and one that we all, I'm sure, subscribe to. But I have to say, the system's lost its way and become largely unresponsive to the public that the system and its inhabitants still claim to serve. I've taken a diagram here from a very, very fine book written by Jennifer Lewington and Graham Orpwood. It's called Overdue Assignment. It was published in 1993. It deserves far more attention than it gets. And you should look at this diagram because it says a lot. Voicing concerns about the state of our public schools can be exceedingly frustrating, and more often than not, an exercise in futility. My book really takes the school system and looks at it from the outside looking in, which makes it a unique book because 90% or more of the books on education are really inside stories written by educators telling the story of their school system or extolling the virtues of public education. Parents advocating mathematics or reading curriculum reforms, families seeking improved special needs programs, or communities fighting small school closures, what happens to them is they hit brick walls or glass ceilings when they try to advance their objectives. And so do faith groups seeking to some modifications or special programs within the public education system. So the system, from the outside looking in, can be likened to what Jennifer Lewington and Graham Orpwood aptly described as a fortress with boundaries separating the insiders from the outsiders in education. And I'm sure we can debate who's in the inside and who's on the outside, but the fundamental point is this: there are boundaries that are erected around this school system to protect those inside it. And during the COVID-19 school shutdown, the fragility of this impenetrable fortress was exposed for everyone to see. You could see superintendents going on Zoom, trying to talk to all the people that reported to them, and knowing that they were doing their own thing. You could see principals trying to track down their teachers, and students just doing what they wanted. The school system actually fragmented during that period. So what did we learn? Bureaucratic managerialism has its shortcomings. And the system, originally conceived as a liberal reform enterprise, aimed at expanding mass schooling and broadening access to the populace, it largely achieved its goals and objectives about 25 years ago. There was universal attendance, programs expanded, lots of resources were put into the public school system. So they achieved that objective, and then something happened. A change, a shift, which I describe as a shift to instructionally focused learning systems, and learnification, a new language emerged. Now, having achieved near universal access, school authorities in the 1980s began to pivot towards introducing what I term bureaucratic managerialism, but it's in the literature all over the place. And this form of instructionally focused education systems. On the surface, it sounds like a wise thing to do, but what it brought with it was a new language, which Gert Basta has termed learnification. And students were no longer students, they were learners. Teaching became facilitating learning, and classrooms were known as learning environments. Only in small schools and independent schools and alternative schools did students continue to really be called students, formally and informally. That's the nature of the system. And all of this, I think, taught us a bit of a lesson about how remote the language became from the people that were being served. The rise of the systematizers in K-12 education is a fascinating topic, and one that I've spent a good deal of my few decades studying. And here you have a photo taken in 2004, the spring of 2004, of Michael Fullen at OISE in the University of Toronto Schools. He came back after being away in Britain and working on the New Labour education reforms. As soon as Dalton McGuinty was elected, he showed up again. And keep in mind that he was the senior advisor to Bob Rae and the NDP when they were in power. So what we call Dr. Michael Fullen is a guru. And I really prefer to call him a school change theorist. And he's the leader of the pack, because school change theorists like Fullen of Toronto's OISE emerged in the 1980s to initiate a North American wave of structural reform. The systematizers saw schools as being incoherent in their instruction from one classroom to the other. And they saw that as a problem, the incoherence of teaching from one class to another. And teacher autonomy was an obstacle to further modernization. So in large part, the reforms were to try to systematize teaching and bring in learnification. And school change came to mean something else, supplanting didactic instruction, knowledge-based curricula, and the teaching of basic skills was replaced by embracing something as ambiguous as ambitious instructional experiences and outcomes for all students. Well, that really turned out to be not what was advanced billed as, and we know only too well some of the consequences of those types of generic approaches to schooling. At the school district level, it was reflected in new forms of school consolidation aimed at turning loose aggregations of schools into systems. So systematizers introduced a technology of learning and a new language, and the school system took on the structure of a system. The new interface is interesting, and anyone who's visited an education center or a Ministry of Education knows the feeling. of the new interface. It's formal, set-piece interactions, very few casual encounters. Everything is formal and systematized. And today's central administrative offices, layers of administration, big box elementary schools, and supersized high schools all testify to a trend of centralization, consolidation, and systematization. Elected school boards survive in most parts of the country. But let's face it, they're a last vestige of local education democracy, and many people consider them simply nuisances and fast becoming a threatened species, particularly in Atlantic Canada, where they've all been eliminated in most of the provinces. Teacher autonomy is of great value in education, and teachers show amazing resilience. How have they survived through all these waves of change, the introduction of learnification, and things that in many ways undermine their authority and autonomy in the classroom? Well, they started to ask the question, what works in the classroom, and is it what we're being told and taught in faculties of education? The teaching of foundational skills and knowledge was subsumed in this new system improvement agenda, which focused almost exclusively on something called educational excellence and equity, which is far removed from teaching and learning in many respects. And the shift also exemplified the logic of standards and accountability, which has been resisted by classroom teachers as another encroachment on their prized autonomy as professionals. Social and emotional learning emerged as the missing link in evaluation, but it too, as my book illustrates, became something to be systematized and measured. And when they discovered that it couldn't be measured, it fell apart and never was implemented. A centrally established accountability infrastructure continued to encounter resistance when it came to penetrating what is known as the black box of the classroom. And that's a famous expression from Larry Cuban and Dylan William. And that not much penetrates the classroom. And that's been a frustration of school reformers for generations. That may well explain why growing numbers of classroom teachers are drawing the line in defense of what's left of their autonomy. And they're actually breathing new life into a movement to have education delivered on a more human student scale. And there are grassroots teacher organizations, one of which I'm very much a part of, called Research Ed, which has sprung up over the past 7 years, challenging the dominance of education gurus, scrutinizing previously uncontested theories, and insisting on teaching informed by evidence-based research into what is the most effective teaching practice. And that, I think, is a huge change and a long overdue change. Let's turn to how we can build back the education system, because I don't want to make this an evening of doom and gloom. You'll see in my book, I work hard at trying to identify the challenges and produce some prescriptions, some guideposts for future action and for policy initiatives at the provincial level. Building back the disrupted and damaged school system is going to involve confronting squarely the fragility and limitations of top-down, bureaucratic K-12 education. And we learned that through the last 6 months, and we're about to learn it again if COVID returns. Education's iron cage, and that's a phrase that is not mine. It came from Max Weber. Max Weber came up with this conception of systems, bureaucratic systems, as being like an iron cage, a structure where individuals find themselves trapped in a web of order, rationality, control, where their movements are not free, and they become very unsettled and dissatisfied. Education's iron cage was exposed during the COVID-19 shutdown when we came to see how dependent students, teachers, and families were on provincial and school district directives. When the directives stopped or were intermittent, look what happened. So what we need is what the phrase is, cage-busting leadership, which is not my term. It comes from Rick Hess from the American Enterprise Institute, educational director. He wrote a fantastic book called The Same Thing Over and Over in 2010. But he's also written a series of articles and books on cage-busting leadership and cage-busting teacher practice. Cage-busting leadership is going to be required to transform our schools into more autonomous social institutions that first and foremost serve students, families, and communities. That is the priority. Well, how do we find our way forward? Some 40 years after the advent of decentralized democratic governance in the form of school-based management, provincial authorities and regional centers remain wedded to system-wide management of virtually every aspect of educational service. School-based management was pioneered in the Edmonton public schools in the 1970s. And Michael Strambitsky was very instrumental to this. And even today, the Edmonton public schools are a model school system of school-based management. It reached its height perhaps in the 1980s and 90s, but it was abandoned virtually everywhere. My book is a clarion call for school administrators and school reformers and ministers of education to look anew at school-based management and to give it a try as an answer to some of the problems we have today. What is needed is a complete rethink of provincial and school district governance and a commitment to clear away the obstacles to building a more agile, responsive community of self-governing schools that puts students first. Without re-engineering education and governance from the schools up, this simply is not going to happen. We're going to be back into a situation with top-down centralized leadership. When I talk about humanizing education, which I do in the book, I mean flipping the system and making it more humanistic. I mean, it should be the new rallying cry of educators seeking structural reform. So flipping the system has emerged as a new COVID-19 era imperative. But decentralizing management and control by itself, as most of you know, will have little or no effect on what really matters, teaching and learning in the schools. It's only the first stage in an overall strategy to make our schools more democratic, responsive, and accountable to parents, teachers, students, and communities. Students should come first, and that sounds like a simple statement, but if only it were true. And students should come first in our schools, and this, of course, is, in my view, best achieved in smaller schools operating on a human scale. We've got to work our way back to that. Since the early 1980s, a human scale education movement has shone the light on the critical need to right-size high schools, because there you see supersized schools and alienation and students not finding their place, and the bureaucratic school system is the actual naked face of the bureaucratic school system is visible in many of those huge consolidated high schools, particularly in Quebec and New Brunswick, where they tend to be larger. The guiding practice of the movement for human scale education embraced small schools, and I define them as 250 to 300 students in the elementary grades and 500 to 600 in the high school level, where you can develop teaching teams. There's more reciprocal relationships. You can really know almost everyone. And in actual fact, there's more opportunities for the right kinds of assessment and enhancement and the development of student leadership and student voice. And most important of all, genuine partnerships with parents. This next slide is going to strike you as odd, because we've had 50 years of student-centered classrooms. And I really think it's time to look at teaching-centered classrooms. And here too, I think we learn through COVID-19 that when the structure disappears, you find out that teachers are on their own and they have to teach directly with the students, and there's no facilitation. They're not really facilitating learning. They're actually having to teach them, and that is a repertoire that needs to be developed. So what we've learned is teaching-centered classrooms still have value, and maybe more so as we try to navigate our way through the current situation. Teachers are clamoring for a much larger role in setting priorities and determining what happens in today's schools. So centralized, bureaucratic, top-down education has a way of generating cycles of new mandates, many rebranded and recycled from previous waves. So most teachers close their eyes and they say, oh my goodness, this too will pass. And they hope to outlast the initiatives. And many do throughout their career. This is not healthy. And it's part of bureaucratic, centralized education. School district consultants and outside experts are inclined to flit around, monitoring progress and attempting to introduce new forms of deeper pedagogy, which teachers interpret to mean they're trying to teach them a new way of teaching after having been in the classroom for 20 or 30 years. Mastering the new technology and the new technocratic language of learnification became, in the new bureaucratic system, a passport to career advancement and accession to senior administrative positions. You have to speak the language in order to be able to implement it. The dominance of the language promulgated by ministries of education and education faculties, and they're very much a part of it, the education faculties, the training of new teachers. It served to subvert the real point of education. Isn't it to teach students to learn something, to learn it for a reason, and to learn it from someone? Isn't that the real purpose of education? How could we lose sight of it? Challenging education gurus and their unproven pedagogical theories, most of which are progressive educational theories, which fly on the surface and aren't really supported by much research. We need to challenge those gurus and those unproven theories. It's going to be essential if we are to base teaching on evidence-based practice and what really works with students in the classroom. Community engagement. There is a phrase that's often discussed, but rarely seen. Parent engagement is now part of the standard lexicon, but in practice, it's incredibly hard to find it exhibited, particularly during the COVID-19 disruption. At the very time we needed to work with parents closely, we didn't have close enough relationships, and we need to work on that. So there has to be more work on community engagement. Luckily, there's work being done in Canada at the University of Saskatchewan by Debbie Peshor. And she's one of Canada's leading researchers on parent-school relations. And Debbie makes a clear definition between school-managed parent involvement, which is what happens, and genuine parent engagement, which is rare to find. School superintendents, let's be honest, and the consultants who implement school management of parents, they've got a lot to unlearn, and somebody has to begin that process. Now, small schools and independents provide a great example of community engagement, and they're actually an exemplar of how you can make it work. So what we need is a completely different model, the family-centric approach, embracing a philosophy of walking alongside parents and genuinely supporting the active engagement of families that make up the school community. Instead of having engagement that's school-centric, it should be family-centric. And that's one of the messages in my book. Looking ahead, we have much to learn, not just from COVID-19, but from the whole pattern of the rise of the modern bureaucratic education state. It's time we started asking questions and interrogating with more degree of care what's actually happened. The pandemic shock has rocked education province to province right across Canada. That big disruption is causing a lot of anguish, fear, and anxiety at all levels, parents, teachers, administrators. The question, I think, is whether it's going to be a creative disruption, or is it going to result in the doubling down of the control and management of all educational services? Let's hope not. Provincial governments, as we know, have really moved to centralization in education. They virtually eliminated or neutered locally elected school boards. and moved dramatically in the direction of centralizing control over their systems. And without access to school-level education governance, concerned parents, educators, and the public were left with limited access or nowhere to turn to address the host of COVID-19 educational problems. So we do need to have more effective school-level governance. 21st century learning skills. Oh my goodness, that is a huge myth. And thankfully, in my book, I do quite a good job, I think, trying to analyze how we got completely taken in by something called 21st century learning skills. And the research is very conclusive. Let me ask you, how many how many skills are there for the 21st century? Are there 6 or 16? And why would you ever initiate change on the basis of something that is so hard to define that no one can agree how many of those skills there are? And there's another thing to consider, is who's driving the agenda. It's all driven by high technology. It's high-tech driven education. Global learning corporations, led by Pearson International and Google, have achieved a dominance through the spread of educational technology and licensed learning resources. And they're finally attracting critical scrutiny, because after how many decades of saying we're developing 21st century learning, investing in technology, and millions and millions of dollars in technology, where was it when we needed it? When the pandemic hit, there wasn't enough of it. It wasn't in the right places. The teachers weren't trained, and students were wanting to use it, but it wasn't accessible to them. The pandemic has also laid bare parental concerns about what's going on under the guise of 21st century learning. And what they learned when the kids were struggling with their homework at home was that there were still major skill deficits in mathematics and literacy. So the fundamentals weren't there, and there was an awful lot of talk about 21st century learning. I'll put it to you this way, and I make the case in the book. You know, generic skills don't exist. They certainly can't be implemented in the classroom. So why would you base the whole system on a set of generic skills that researchers in cognitive learning say cannot be measured, and they may not exist? I really think we need to, before we follow the OECD further along that path, I think we should be asking questions. Now, when normalcy returns, you can expect parents and community activists to start noticing school consolidation and bigger schools further and further away. There might actually be a decline in enrollment because people will choose other alternatives. So you can bet that there'll be more consolidation. And I'm going to predict you're going to see more Save Our School movements against the relentless advance of educational centralization and school consolidation. So let's be ready for that and not simply nod when people say we need to consolidate everything. Public choice in education is extremely valuable. And I believe that it should exist within public education. And I believe there are signs of a shift. Emergency distance learning, let's just take in the Toronto District School Board and everywhere else where it's been studied, let's face it, was an unmitigated disaster. There was an article in Toronto Life magazine last month which made that case, and it was very convincing. Coming out of a 3-month-long school shutdown and a 6-month hiatus in schooling, parents are either embracing or seriously considering the full range of alternative school options. In the Greater Toronto area, there are well over 200,000, I think close to 200,000 parents who've chosen online learning. They didn't send the kids back to in-person schooling. So COVID-19 has shaken confidence in public education. And it's a threat, but it's also an opportunity. Hundreds of thousands of students and parents are opting out of in-person schooling and choosing online learning or gravitating to alternative school options, including home education learning pods, where a group of parents would hire a teacher and begin teaching. I think that's a direct consequence of COVID-19, where parents just couldn't continue for a second round teaching the kids themselves and filling in all the gaps. It's time to embrace the future. And my book really does point us in the direction of a better future. I see new priorities coming into clearer focus in the wake of the pandemic. I describe it as a new set of priorities which are emerging. Put students first, deprogram education ministries and school districts, listen more to parents and teachers in the schools, and design and build smaller schools at the center of urban neighborhoods and rural communities. If we value that type of education, we should design schools to fit that type of education. In the wake of COVID-19, we are more and more aware of the critical need for meaningful public engagement, rebuilding social capital, and revitalizing local communities, because everyone's been atomized and spending time in their homes, and we need to build it back. New school options, previously considered improbable solutions, are coming to the fore. So it's the time to be thinking of new innovations and building back the system better. With my book comes a call to turn the system right side up and chart a more constructive path forward. Re-engineering our system and saving it, really, is essentially about taking back our schools. Thank you very much for your attention this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Bennett. That was excellent. I of course, as you know, I love your research, the way you frame it, and of course your recommendations. So as we head to the Q&A, we have a number of questions that have come in. Please, to all of you in the audience, please feel free to send more questions. Where we're going to start, so you finished up by saying re-engineering the system, taking back our schools. I love that. I want to get into that in more detail, what exactly you mean by that. Before we do, if I can play devil's advocate for just a minute. So those who are in favor of the status quo, who make statements like, as we saw even as recently as last week in the Toronto Star, that Canada's public schools are the envy of the world, and they point to PISA studies as their evidence of that, and make statements that if we tamper with the system at all, you're going to destroy the world's best education system. So in spite of everything you've said this evening, they still hold to that and say, but no, we're the top of the PISA rankings, at least out here in BC, and in Quebec and Alberta has often been up there too. You dispute that right at the beginning of your book. Please fill us in. How do you go about disputing that? How can we be armed with a response to that? What evidence do you cite?
Thank you. It's great to start with the best question of all, which is Andy Hargraves and Michael Fullen produced a remarkable op-ed in the Toronto Star entitled How to Ruin the World's Best Education System. So thank you for bringing it up. It's really unique to discuss this because Andy Hargraves has spent most of his career opposed to standardized testing, ranking students, and PISA scores. So I was a little bit startled to see that he cited the performance of Canada on international testing as one of the evidence. Well, the legitimacy of that whole argument needs to be challenged by people who know the research. And I've done an awful lot of work on this. When you trace back the origins of Canada's schools are the envy of the world, what those two authors mean is Ontario, because they nominate Ontario every time as the example of Canada. So for example, it's so misleading. It's just Ontario that they're talking about, and Albertans out there and British Columbians out there. You know how unfair that is, but Ontarians have a way of defining it. It's called Ontario-centric education. So this is an example of Ontario-centric thinking. Now, it came from a McKinsey and Company study in 2007-8, and then another one in 2010. And do you know who wrote the foreword and engineered that? Michael Fullen. And I went through that report, and it's been heavily criticized by scholars in Britain, particularly Frank Cofield, who wrote a devastating critique of that whole series. And he challenged the research and so on. So I thought, well, let me look and see on what basis is Ontario the greatest school system? Well, first of all, it's the continuity in leadership. That is McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne.
Yes.
That was the number one point. And these two these two fellows happen to be the main advisors to McGinty and Gwynn. So I think there's a question there. But more to the point is this, that it can be challenged on a number of grounds. And I think you have to question the whole legitimacy of that. When I look at the Ontario school system from 2004 to 2015, and there's a lot in the book on this, spending went up 57%. It rose from about 14 billion to 22 billion. There were gains in equity. They closed the gap between those who were the least advantaged. They caught up. But if you look at every other measure, you know, in terms of mathematics, there was static or no growth. And there's still a real problem with mathematics in Ontario. And when you look at other things, just how much money was poured into that school system, the question is cost-benefit analysis here. Surely there were gains, but were those gains justified in terms of how much money went into them? No other province in Canada could afford that. And that's why I think the whole Ontario-centric view, I wrote a piece in the National Post about this about 3 years ago. I called it Ontario's Educational Mirage. And I looked at how it was all based. So thank you for asking me. I think there's more evidence that it's shaky. By the way, I looked at every chapter in my book is a rebuttal to that statement.
Okay, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Okay, another great question here. So decentralizing the system sounds good in theory, but how do you resolve the tension between autonomy and accountability? Also, are there concerns about equitable outcomes for students with a move to greater localization and school board autonomy? So
yes, there are.
Sounds good. Autonomy versus accountability.
Right. Yes, there are. And that's where we need to start any discussion about what do we hope to achieve with school-based management and governance. It's not the answer to everything, but it's a foundation. It establishes a new set of relationships within the school system. It establishes that schools are small, that the unit of organization is not the large unit. I've got all kinds. I'm one of Canada's leading researchers on, believe it or not, the large unit. That's what it was called, and it still is. It's an even larger unit of organization. So going back to smaller units is a fundamental change, and that means you focus on building back the school system from the bottom up. So there's more engagement, there's more excitement. It's going to take 3 to 5 years to reorganize the school system along those lines. So you get more ownership. And you know what's interesting is, I was looking at school-based management book, and I have it right here, if you just permit me to reach over. This is live, so let me reach over here. And clarity of purpose, leadership, professionalism, lack of bureaucratic control, true ownership by stakeholders, effective use of resources, competition is good, and more choice within the system and more variation from one school to the other. Those are the primary advantages, and for those that are professionals, the School-Based Management Guide, written by Richard G. Neal, is a very fine book, and it still is a good handbook for those hoping to introduce that. But my point is this, you start with building reciprocal arrangements, and where do you start in reconstructing the system? Now, equity and sharing of resources. Let's just take the example of the Edmonton school system. They started with a rather radical shift to all 2/3 of the budget was shifted immediately to the schools.
Yes.
And over time, they've shifted it back to the center to the degree they realize there are 3 or 4 critical needs that must be settled and distributed from the center. And one is transportation and infrastructure repairs and things. That has to be centered and from the center. Purchasing, computer distribution. There are certain core functions there that need to be administered from the center, maybe through a consortia or various other arrangements. And the biggest one, I think, is special education and inclusion and the development of what we are known for around the world. I would never want to see us lose ground there. So every single school in the system would be would have minimum standards they would have to adhere to in terms of inclusion and in terms of special needs support. And that is a bottom line for me. So I think the argument that you can do one or the other, I think you can do both. Another thing is a lot of people miss in my proposal. I'm very much on a developmental strategy for school-based management. Develop the functioning school-based organizational structures, then develop coordinating structures around them, and then there's more accountability. It's not just from the province to the schools. There's an intermediate body we need to work on. I've got in the book, I go into a great deal of detail, more than most people will want, on how you actually do that.
Sure. Now, if we were to zoom in just onto teachers, so looking at the autonomy of teachers, one question here is, if we had more teacher autonomy, one person here is arguing they would likely strive to teach more content and be less invested in 21st century progressive pedagogies. But what gives you this confidence? Aren't the faculties of education still aggressively forming new teachers in accordance with these disproven methods you've addressed? Aren't the faculties of education one more bar within that iron cage that needs to be addressed?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, everyone in the Faculty of Education is going to furiously flip through the book and look in the index for all my references to faculties of education, because there's a bit of a critique of faculties of education, having taught in 3 or 4 of them in various capacities. I know them well, having graduated from the Faculty of Education, U of T, with a doctorate from OISE, having spent 11 years at OISE studying graduate work. Boy, do I know faculties of education. So when I say this, I think I'm just being honest. They're not really research centers. It's all the result of their background. There's really only one major research university, OISE, and they have such an orientation in their research that they're only serving a certain segment. And I make the point that there needs to be a far heavier emphasis on cognitive research, and there's a whole area of research that's not being introduced to new teachers. There's 2 areas of great weakness in faculties of education. One is cognitive learning and the process of how students actually learn and how you teach. That's number one. And number two, and I think this is significant too, is just student discipline and behavior. It's just, and research ed has gained tremendous support around the world. 50,000 teachers to come into research, and that is what it's about. It's about cognitive learning and making evidence-based research, and it's also in many ways about student discipline and helping teachers to run the room, and because we've had a cycle where teachers were facilitating, they weren't really managing the schools. And I think it's time to take a look at that, and respect and responsibility would be the approach I would use.
Sure, and there's a few questions that kind of, I think, feed into that. Some want you to tease out more the idea around learning centers rather than, learning centered rather than teacher centered, or learner student centered learning. So if you could tease out a bit, and then feeding into that, further comment on family-centric models. That's something that in BC, for sure, within the independent school sector, that was very much the reality during COVID, and I think BC responded very well. It was very fruitful out here. But if you could speak to that, family-centric models, and then the differences between learning-centered, teacher-centered, student-centered.
Well, let me say this. Explicit instruction is still the most effective way of teaching and learning. I have a book right beside me here, How Learning Happens, written by. So
you said explicit instruction?
Yes.
Okay.
Paul Kirshner and Carl Hendrick. It's right beside me here. And it goes through in detail how students learn. And explicit instruction still is the most effective way of teaching and learning. That's not what's being presented in faculties of education. And I'm in favor of a balance, but the balance is off. There needs to be a rejigging, because cognitive research, and there's tons of it, that's come out, and all the authors are in the book and they're quoted, shows that we need to be looking at that more seriously, how students learn, and informing our teaching practice with that. It's not good enough to simply have play learning, discovery learning. They are working on engagement. I think we've got great engagement. We also have noisy classrooms. OECD ranked us 27th out of 33 on noise and in our classrooms, and a lack of focus in our classrooms. We don't talk about that because it's a comment on our pedagogy. So we need to look at what's wrong with the current pedagogy. The second point was parent engagement, and I want to make sure I give you your question due attention. Family-centric schools are a great idea. I don't know why they don't happen. I think it's that it's just easier for administrators and principals and vice principals to bring everyone into the school and organize them around the school. It takes a leap of faith and I think a lot of skill to go out to the community and to work with families. You know, can you imagine how much more effective we would have been in COVID-19 if we'd had far more active participation of parents in the school system? They would have willingly helped to sort out a lot of those problems instead of being kept at a distance. And that, you know, I think we could have gained, and we may yet see the benefit of that. So parent-centric or family-centric schools, hugely important. And you know, we spent, what, 6 months in a family unit? Well, I guess we need family-centric schools. We got them already, whether we willed them or not.
Okay, so but briefly back to your point about noisiness in the classroom. Student discipline, I don't, countless numbers of teachers have said, there's no way that I can enforce any form of discipline in the classroom, especially when you get into inner city schools where a number of my friends are teachers. How do you navigate student discipline, even with cognitive research? Who decides what is right? How do you approach negotiating differing views on student discipline?
Well, I'm a former school head, and I headed 2 of Canada's better known independent schools. So I'm very much aware of the limitations of school leadership and how, no matter how good your intentions are, you don't always get it right. But I have to say that, you know, you need to be clear about what your vision is for the school. There needs to be a focus. Is that focus academics? Is that focus on being the best at what you're doing or not? And if you're unclear and you're just trying to be all things to all people, you're not going to be very successful. So effective schools are schools which know what they're about and are clear about their expectations. I believe Tom Bennett's book, Creating a Culture, is a hugely successful book in the UK. And you have to create a culture around things that everyone agrees on. And it's hard work, and it has to continually be revisited year after year. But if you don't know what your focus is, you're never going to be able to pull everybody together. And I think smaller schools, by their very nature, are easier to pull together. I think one of the strongest arguments against the consolidated secondary school is it's impossible. Let me say this. I believe they're ungovernable.
Sure.
I think you can manage them. I don't really think that you can lead them as well. You have to be an extraordinary individual to lead something as complex as that organization.
Okay, but if we now zoom out again and looking at the overall system, if we decentralize and fragment these various schools, what about the sense of public education as a public good? What's the role of strong public education in the 21st century? And you had made a comment within your presentation about fitting this model within a public system. Where do independent schools fit within that model, within your envisioned system?
That's like 3 questions, Dave. That's 3 questions. So I'll try to peel them away. Those are good questions. So the first one, let's just take the first one, if I can remember it. Maybe you just rephrase that. The first one I think was
decentralization. So public education as a public good. How does that
Okay.
fit into a fragmented model?
Got it. I believe that, let's just take a school system with 70 or 80 schools. You would need 160 really fantastic leaders, and there would be maybe 80 school leaders and 80 parents. This is unique. And you would spend the time developing them. And you know where you're going to get those school leaders? They're going to be some of your superintendents. They're going to be back in the schools because they'll quickly realize that there's more to be gained from being successful in leading a school and demonstrating to everyone what an effective school looks like than basically going up the ladder and being in the higher rung of the administration. So I think I see opportunities for people who are extremely talented. I never understood why the best and most talented people weren't in the schools. So that first and foremost, develop the core of leadership from the school up and start, and it's gonna take a long time, but that's the way out of this. And here's how you strengthen public education. If you put your strongest and most effective people in interface with students and teachers. Why would you hide them in an office? And why would you actually treat them like, well, they've graduated away from that, and put them in the administration? In my book, I make a really good point. Education centers are as far as possible away from teachers and students and the schools. They're in industrial parks. They're not even in schools. So they have a culture of their own, and people are being trained to be managers and systematizers. They're not even. So I think you need to shift the priorities around. I believe public education would be a lot stronger if you followed my recommendations.
Okay, so now feeding into that a bit more, professional learning communities. There's one comment here about someone who's done research in that field, looking at PLCs as a way to see cultural change within education and as a way of breaking down the bureaucratic structures. So how do you see professional learning communities as a means to towards improvement, like you propose in the book?
I'm actually a proponent of book clubs, not professional learning communities. Okay. Research Ed is very much in the forefront of recommending. Somebody wants to call me, so I'm sorry, I'm busy. But in actual fact, Research Ed is very big on trying to introduce an idea of you read a book and you share it. It's the best research on teaching practice. And you don't talk about we're going to get together and have a good time and have collegiality. There's a real thing in education. There's a difference between conviviality and congeniality and genuine collaboration. And there is a real difference. I've been part of critical friends groups. I was part of a movement some years ago, and it was based on critical friends groups. And the problem with them was people were too sensitive to one another and they wouldn't confront some of the challenges. Like, really, that wasn't a very good lesson. You ever hear that in a critical friends group? Not likely. So I think you need to have a higher degree of professionalization. I would say that professional learning communities are the most overhyped thing in education. I really don't see them. They're better than no one discussing professional matters. I wouldn't argue that, but there's so much more. For example, bringing in someone who can work with you on the latest research on reading, the latest research in mathematics. Oh my goodness, that's so much more valuable.
Okay, we're almost out of time, and there's still so many questions. So earlier you talked about Ontario-centric, and to what issues are they exclusively in Ontario? So Alberta's new school accountability framework reduces the number of central ministry measures and requires locally responsive measures as part of the reporting to the ministry. Do you see that as a positive initiative to be emulated elsewhere?
Yes. I think a lot of things from Alberta don't get properly aired out in the rest of Canada. I've been an advocate for looking at Alberta in all kinds of ways. I think the amount of choice in the Alberta system, the options given to parents, I don't think it's perfect, but it's certainly in the lead role. I'm glad to see that they've rediscovered their commitment to educational excellence, because that was really wobbly. When I started doing my research in the 1980s, Alberta was in the forefront of education, no question about it. I think Alberta deserves far more credit. I'm also a big supporter of British Columbia. I think there's some wonderful things going on there. And I also am a big supporter, and this is going to sound odd, of the BC Teachers Federation research. I think they do wonderful research, and a lot of teachers' unions could. We don't have a great research capacity in this country, and their unions are doing a good job, some of them, and the think tanks. We've had to rely almost exclusively on think tanks to bring new ideas into our school system.
Well, you got to keep guys like me employed, right? So we're pretty much out of time. We are out of time, but there's many questions left. I want to close with one last question, because I think this will tie us off. There are many on this webinar who are in positions to actually do something about it. People who are in leadership within provincial governments, and your core argument is for structural change in favor of school-based management and governance. But what actionable steps can and should be taken that won't be viewed as disruptive or radical? And specifically for those in government, where should they start in making re-engineering the system a reality?
First of all, commit to community-based education and community-based management and governance, and make that a priority. That's number one. So the policy has to be overarching. Secondly, work on developing a new generation of leadership, because one of the great failings of all school-based management programs is the leadership at the school level isn't capable enough. And you have to invest, and you have to train, and you have to encourage that. So I would say spend all your time on trying to develop at the school level. Think if you put all your best, brightest, and most talented people back in the schools, how much better the school system would be. And yes, let's face it, my book points out that most school districts are run by algorithms.
Sure.
That everything's allocated by percentages of this, and it's an algorithmic system. So put some of the talent back in the school system. Take the time, spend 3 to 5 years redeveloping it, and then make all the other changes I've made. There's many other changes in the book, and but it takes time, it takes patience, and it takes a consistent approach over time to see changes in education. Awesome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Paul Bennett. Thank you to our audience for taking the time for this. This presentation will be uploaded to our website and to YouTube, so you can go back and review it. Please do buy the book. There is tons of rich content, much more than what we had time to discuss tonight. Thank you very much, and good night to all of you.